Communication is certainly a very deep thing, and it's even more difficult between groups that have different viewpoints or across cultures. And I'm going to take you on a journey, both metaphorically and in a sense literally, to talk about good communication and working at the interface, I stress that word interface, working at the interface of cultures. Now let's take an example. If I move over to the board and just draw an abstract idea of, say, a major highway. And here in Central Australia, the Stuart Highway is very important to us. So imagine the Stuart Highway. It's a long, straight road taking us to our goal, which is usually for us either Adelaide or Darwin, but we'll talk about Darwin. So we want to get to Darwin. And here we've got this road. Let's just bring it in a little bit. And let's just talk about it. So if I talk about the road, when we travel down a road, we've had to learn a rule book, haven't we? We had to go to the, RDA or whatever to pass our test, get a license. And when we're on the road, we know that, say, for instance, we should drive on the left-hand side. And that's pretty important in the territory because we get a lot of tourists from overseas who sometimes think they should drive on the right-hand side. Driving down the road, we know that the Stuart Highway is basically a very good road compared to the old days. You go over nice bridges, you can go a decent speed when the country, the bush is cut back either side. You know that other people on the road understand the rules, that they're going to drive on the left-hand side, that you're going to have signposts telling you how far it is to a certain place. So you feel secure. Even if you don't know the countryside, you have those brown signs that tell you, tourist signs that tell you how far it is to Catherine Gorge, or, the Devil's Marbles, where to stop for them. So basically, understanding the rules, being able to understand and read the signs, you're right. You're not going to get lost. There's fuel stops. You're not going to fall into a creek. You've got bridges and so on. And it's very rare that the highway's cut these days. So that's the first example. Rules on a highway, which is a bit like society. We have clear rules to operate. And, those rules were changing, there's pressures, and especially in a democratic society, so it's an ongoing process of equilibrium. But I'd like to draw your attention to one area, and that is the difference between your family and personal life and your working life. So let's imagine that one side of the road is your working life here. That's your working life. And the other side of the road is your family life. Now what I find interesting about this is, most of the time in a family, well, we know the rules, don't we? We know our family's rules. You don't need to write it down. But in public life, rules are written down and most people abide by them and understand them. Otherwise we'd all be in prison or whatever. But our working life and our family life are two different spheres, aren't they? And within each of those spheres, we understand the rules and we operate our lives. Now let me take this a little bit further. Let's suppose that you're working with an organisation you really love. You know that it's beyond compliance. You really buy into the vision and ideals. Friday afternoon, your boss comes in and says, "Excuse me, but we've just about to land this really important piece of business and it's absolutely vital, your work. We need you here on Saturday. This is make or break for us. Very, very important. But you have promised, suppose you have a son who plays footy, or a daughter that plays, I don't know, netball. You've promised them you'll go and be at their sports day. It's a big thing. They've been waiting. You work hard. You don't have enough time with your family. So what's happened to you? Your boss has walked in. What decision do you make? Do you stay at work and say, bugger the family? Or do you go to the family and say, well, don't worry about work? That is not an easy decision, is it? Because it is a no-win place to be. Because if you come back to your family and say, and tell your son or your daughter, you know by the look in their eyes what they're thinking. Your nearest and dearest. And how many of us might spend time in work only later in life to retire and be very lonely because we don't have support from our families, because we didn't support them. On the other hand, you love the work you're in and you'd like to be there. So what we see is the interface between our working lives and our family lives is not clearly defined in our society, is it? There's always constant debate. So let's draw a little bit of a jaggedy line down the middle of the road between our family life and our working life. And that interface, some of the properties, if we just look at it, I'm not here to moralise, that's very important. We're not talking about what should be done, but we're just looking at what actually is the case. So when we look at it, we can see that we have basically clear rules for work and basically clear rules for family life. But when the two conflict, that area between is a very fluid area where there's not a lot of rules, or rules aren't clear, and there can be a lot of dispute, a lot of debate, a lot of heat generated by those issues, and it absorbs a lot more of our energy than than the actual interface size itself. So the interface size is that size, our energy going into it is that size. It causes a lot of divisions, a lot of different ideas, and reduces cohesion. It's a bit like two sets of waves coming around a headland, and where they meet is extremely choppy and often very dangerous and treacherous seas. So I'd just like to leave that with you there. Not moralising, just pointing that out. Now if we take the Aboriginal road, let's just imagine how the characteristics of that road. And a lot of Aboriginal people have said, oh, well, our road is actually a very broad road. Let me draw it in black, so it's the same colour. Our road is a very broad road. But as we know, we're working towards living in harmony, different ideas coming together. But let's imagine that that's a bush highway. And the bush highways are very broad, generally very broad these days, broad roads. People like to come for their holidays and take their four-wheel drives a lot up these highways these days. But they have certain different characteristics to the Stuart Highway. Firstly, they're very broad. Secondly, they're very often not very well graded, so there's big corrugations, sometimes really big corrugations. There can be huge potholes, there can be bull dust. You can come round a corner and there's been a flash flood or thunderstorm and there's a washout and you've got a 3-foot little cliff to go down into a creek, and you're travelling at 105, 10 k's an hour. There might be a lot of cattle on that road. No fence at all. No warning, camels, whatever. So a bush road, you have rather different rules to obey, don't you? You have to often know that road really well. You have to be clear that you've got to take a lot more care. You've got to know about the countryside often. Sometimes you might have no signpost to turn off to where you want to go. So you have to keep a look on the countryside and look at the hills to know where you are. So if we imagine that bush road, that unsealed road, is the Aboriginal road, it's the broad road, and we'll come on to why it's broad in a minute.